My name is Ryan McKenzie, and I need you to understand something right up front. I wasn't some street corner dealer who got lucky. I was a businessman who happened to be in the cocaine business. And for 10 years, I ran Miami like it was my personal empire. But before I tell you about the fall, you need to understand a rise and how a middle-class white kid from Coral Gables became the most powerful drug trafficker south of Atlanta. I grew up in privilege, not obscene wealth, but comfortable middle-class life in one of Miami's nicest neighborhoods. My father, Robert McKenzie, was a successful real estate attorney who specialized in international transactions. My mother, Catherine, was a former model who had married well and spent her days managing charity events and tennis lessons at the Coral Gables Country Club. From the outside, we looked like the American dream. Beautiful house, European cars, private school education, summer vacations in the Hamptons. But behind the manicured lawn and perfect family photos, my childhood was built on a foundation of emotional neglect and impossible expectations. My father was consumed with building his legal empire, working 16-hour days, and treating our family dinners like business meetings. My mother medicated her loneliness with prescription pills and wine, transforming from loving parent to absent stranger by the time I hit my teenage years. By the time I was 16, I was essentially raising myself in a mansion that felt more like a museum than a home. I had access to money but not affection, material possessions but not meaningful relationships. The cocaine started as teenage rebellion, something to do at parties in Star Island mansions while my parents attended charity galas and pretended our family wasn't falling apart. But cocaine in Miami in the late 80s wasn't just a party drug. It was a foundation and economy that made the city the unofficial capital of Latin American commerce. While other teenagers were worried about SAT scores and college applications, I was learning about supply chains, profit margins, and risk management from Colombian suppliers who treated drug trafficking like any other import-export business. My entry into the trade happened almost by accident. I was 19, a sophomore at the University of Miami studying business, when I met Carlos Mendoza at a party in Coconut Grove. Carlos was a few years older, impeccably dressed, and had the kind of easy confidence that came from never having to worry about money. He drove a Ferrari, lived in a penthouse on Brickell Avenue, and always seemed to have beautiful women and expensive champagne wherever he went. What I didn't know initially was that Carlos was a mid-level distributor for the Medellin cartel, moving product through Miami's port and distributing it to dealers throughout the Southeast. When he offered me a job doing import logistics, I thought I was getting involved in legitimate international trade. By the time I understood what we were really importing, I was already hooked. Not on the drugs, but on the lifestyle they provided. The money was intoxicating. Within 6 months, I was making more than my father's law firm generated in a year. I bought a house in Key Biscayne, a yacht that I docked at the Miami Beach Marina, and cars that turned heads on Ocean Drive. But more than the material wealth, I was addicted to the respect that came from being connected to real power in a city where power meant everything. Miami in the early 90s was like the Wild West with palm trees and Art Deco architecture. The cocaine trade had transformed the city from sleepy retirement destination to international playground, and everyone, from bankers to politicians to society wives, was either directly involved or willingly blind to where the money was coming from. The clubs on South Beach, the restaurant in Coral Gables, the galleries in Wynwood, all of it was financed by Colombian powder, and nobody asked questions as long as the party kept going. My operation started small, but grew exponentially. I had advantages that street-level dealers didn't. I looked like a legitimate businessman. I understood international finance from my business studies, and I had family connections in Miami's legal and social circles that provided both cover and clients. Within 3 years, I was importing directly from suppliers in Bogota, bypassing middle-level distributors, and keeping profits that should have been shared with multiple layers of the organization. The logistics were sophisticated. We used legitimate shipping companies to move product through the port of Miami, hidden in everything from coffee shipments to furniture imports. I had accountants laundering money through real estate investments, offshore banks, and even legitimate businesses that I purchased as fronts. By 1995, my organization was moving over 500 kilograms per month and generating gross revenues of $30 million annually. But success in the drug trade comes with complications that don't exist in legitimate business. The violence was constant and increasingly personal. Rival organizations wanted my territory. Suppliers demanded absolute loyalty, and customers who didn't pay on time had to be handled with methods that would make Gordon Gekko look like a Sunday school teacher. The first time I ordered someone killed, I was 24 years old and sitting in my office overlooking Biscayne Bay, discussing the problem of a distributor in Orlando who had been skimming product and selling it independently. My lieutenant, a Cuban enforcer named Miguel Santos, explained that we had to send a message to maintain discipline in the organization. "Ryan," Miguel said in his heavily accented English, "in this business, respect comes from fear. If people think you're weak, you're dead. It's that simple." I gave the order with the same casual tone I might use to approve a marketing budget. But that night, lying in my penthouse apartment while Miami's lights twinkled below like fallen stars, I understood that I had crossed a line that separated legitimate business from something much darker. The violence escalated as my territory expanded. Bodies were dropping from Miami Beach to Fort Lauderdale, and the DEA's Miami field office was building cases against every major player in the city. Federal agents had photos of me eating dinner at Joe's Stone Crab, surveillance footage of meetings at the Fontainebleau Hotel, and financial records that connected me to legitimate businesses throughout South Florida. But I felt untouchable. I had lawyers on retainer who specialized in federal drug cases, accountants who could make money disappear faster than a magician, and most importantly, I had something that most drug dealers didn't. I looked like someone who belonged in Miami's power circles. Police would see me driving through Coral Gables and assume I was some trust fund kid enjoying his inheritance. Federal agents would watch me at charity events and think I was just another young businessman with too much money and too little sense. The hubris was intoxicating and ultimately fatal. By 1997, I was living like a king in a palace built on powder, convinced that my intelligence and connections made me immune to the consequences that had destroyed every other major dealer in Miami's history. I was throwing parties at my Star Island mansion that attracted celebrities, politicians, and society figures who either didn't know or didn't care where my money came from. But empires built on cocaine don't last forever, especially when they're run by people who start believing their own mythology. The DEA had been watching me for 3 years, building a RICO case that would eventually involve 47 defendants and span 5 states. They had wiretaps, financial records, surveillance footage, and most dangerously, they had informants within my own organization who were providing real-time intelligence about my activities. The night my empire crumbled started like any other night in paradise. I was having dinner at my favorite restaurant in South Beach, discussing expansion plans with my closest associates, when my phone started buzzing with emergency calls. Federal agents were hitting locations throughout Miami simultaneously, and my name was on warrants that covered everything from drug conspiracy to money laundering to ordering murders. By dawn, my $30 million empire was reduced to evidence in federal storage facilities. My associates were either dead or in custody, and I was facing charges that carried a potential life sentence. The boy king of Miami's cocaine trade was about to discover that in God's economy, every sin has a price, and every debt eventually comes due. But what I didn't know, sitting in that federal holding cell while DEA agents counted my assets and prosecutors calculated my sentence, was that God was about to use the worst night of my life to begin writing the best chapter. Sometimes you have to lose everything you think you want to find everything you actually need. The Federal Detention Center in Miami is where American dreams go to die, and on November 15th, 1998, mine died harder than most. Walking through those doors in federal custody, wearing an orange jumpsuit instead of the Armani suits that had been my uniform, I felt the full weight of how far I had fallen in less than 24 hours. The booking process was designed to strip away every vestige of the identity I had built over the previous decade. They took my Rolex, my diamond earring, my Italian leather shoes, all the symbols of success that had defined Ryan McKenzie, the cocaine kingpin of South Beach. What remained was Ryan McKenzie, federal inmate 47821-019, just another drug dealer waiting to find out how many decades he would spend behind concrete walls. The first few weeks were psychological torture. Federal prison isn't like the movies. It's not constant violence and gang warfare. It's something worse. It's the slow dissolution of hope, day by day, hour by hour, until you start to forget who you were before the walls and wonder if you'll remember when you get out. My cellmate was a Cuban named Eduardo, who had been caught bringing cocaine through Miami International Airport. Eduardo had been a chemistry professor in Havana before fleeing to Miami in the early 90s, and he spent his days reading scientific journals and his nights staring at the ceiling, calculating how much of his life he had traded for American dollars that were now evidence in a federal courthouse. You know what the worst part is, amigo? Eduardo asked me during one of our endless conversations. It's not that we got caught. It's that we thought we were smarter than everyone who got caught before us. Pride, man. Pride is what kills us all in the end. The legal proceedings were a masterclass in federal prosecution. The government had built their case like a symphony, with each piece of evidence supporting the others in perfect harmony. They had recordings of me discussing shipments, photographs of me meeting with Colombian suppliers, financial records that trace my money from street sales to offshore accounts. Most devastatingly, they had 3 members of my inner circle who had agreed to cooperate in exchange for reduced sentences. My attorney, David Goldberg, one of Miami's most expensive criminal lawyers, explained my options with a brutal honesty that only comes from someone who has seen too many young men destroyed by their own ambitions. I could fight the charges and risk life imprisonment, or I could plead guilty and hope for mercy from a federal judge who had already sentenced dozens of drug dealers to decades behind bars. Ryan, David told me during one of our attorney-client meetings, "You're 28 years old. You can spend the rest of your life in prison. Or you can take responsibility for what you've done and maybe get out while you're still young enough to build something different." But taking responsibility meant confronting the full scope of what I had done, and that was a reckoning I wasn't prepared for. The government sentencing memorandum read like a catalog of destruction. Murders I had ordered, families destroyed by addiction, communities poisoned by the violence that followed my operations. The Ryan Mackenzie they described wasn't a sophisticated businessman. He was a predator who had used his privilege and education to cause damage on an industrial scale. The breaking point came during my 6th month in custody, when I received a letter from Maria Santos, the widow of a man who had been killed on my orders 3 years earlier. Miguel Santos, my former enforcer, had given the government information about every murder connected to my organization, including the execution of Maria's husband, who had been skimming money from one of our distribution networks. "I don't hate you," Maria wrote in Spanish, which I had my cellmate Eduardo translate. "I hate what you did to my family. But I'm writing to tell you that I've been praying for you, because I believe that even people who do terrible things can be forgiven by God. My husband wasn't perfect, but he was trying to provide for our children. When you ordered his death, you didn't just kill him. You destroyed our family. But maybe God can use your story to prevent other families from being destroyed." That letter broke something inside me that I didn't even know was still intact. For the first time since my arrest, I cried. Not for myself, not for my lost empire, but for the people whose lives I had shattered in pursuit of money and power that ultimately meant nothing. Eduardo found me that night, sitting on my bunk and sobbing like a child. Without saying a word, he handed me a worn paperback Bible and said, "Maybe it's time you started looking for different kind of answers, hermano." I had been raised Catholic. Sunday masses at the Church of the Little Flower in Coral Gables, First Communion, Confirmation, all the rituals that middle-class families use to maintain respectability. But I had never actually read the Bible, never really thought about God as anything more than a cultural tradition that you acknowledged on Christmas and Easter. But in that federal cell, with nothing but time and an increasing awareness of the depth of my guilt, I started reading. Not looking for legal loopholes or philosophical comfort, but searching for some understanding of how a person like me, someone who had been given every advantage and used them to cause maximum damage, could ever find peace. The passage that stopped me was from the Gospel of Luke, where Jesus is dying on the cross between 2 thieves. One thief mocks him, but the other asks to be remembered when Jesus enters his kingdom. Jesus responds, "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." "Eduardo," I said after reading that passage, "this thief probably lived a terrible life. He's dying as a criminal. But Jesus promises him paradise. How is that possible?" Eduardo smiled. the first genuine smile I had seen from him in months. That's grace, amigo. It's not about what we deserve. It's about what God offers, even people like us. That night, alone in my cell while Eduardo slept, I did something I hadn't done since childhood. I prayed, not bargaining with God to reduce my sentence or promising to be good if he got me out of trouble. This was something deeper. Confession, surrender, and a desperate plea for forgiveness that went beyond anything any court could offer. I spent the next year studying the Bible with the same intensity one had once applied to cocaine trafficking. Eduardo became my teacher, helping me understand theological concepts that had never made sense during my privileged Catholic upbringing. We started a Bible study group that met in the prison chapel, attracting other inmates who were searching for something beyond the anger and despair that consumed most federal prisoners. The group started small, me, Eduardo, a few other drug dealers who were facing serious time. But word spread to the prison that something different was happening in the chapel on Tuesday and Thursday nights. Inmates who had never shown interest in religion started attending, not because they were looking for God necessarily, but because they were looking for hope. My transformation didn't happen overnight, but it was undeniable. The anger that had driven my criminal career was replaced by something I had never experienced. Genuine remorse, not regret about getting caught, but true sorrow for the pain I had caused people who had never done anything to hurt me. When I finally pled guilty and was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison, I accepted the punishment not as a victim of an unfair system, but as someone who understood that justice sometimes looks like consequences. The judge, the Honorable Patricia Martinez, had seen dozens of drug dealers express hollow remorse in hopes of lighter sentences. But she later told my attorney that something about my acceptance of responsibility seemed different, deeper and more authentic than the usual courtroom performances. "Mr. Mackenzie," she said during my sentencing hearing, "you have caused immeasurable damage to this community. But I also see something in you that gives me hope that you might use your remaining years to repair some of that damage, even if it's from behind prison walls." As I was let out of that courtroom to begin serving a quarter-century sentence, I wasn't the same person who had built a cocaine empire in South Beach. That Ryan Mackenzie was dead. In his place was someone who understood that real wealth wasn't measured in dollars or power, but in the ability to sleep peacefully knowing that your life had made the world better rather than worse. Federal prison was about to become my seminary, and God was about to use the worst chapter of my life to begin writing the best one. The United States Penitentiary at Coleman, Florida, became my home for what would be the most transformative years of my life. Located in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by swampland and broken dreams, Coleman housed some of America's most dangerous white-collar and organized crime figures. This wasn't a place where people want to get better. It was where they went to disappear. But God has a way of using the most unlikely places to accomplish his purposes. And over the next 15 years, that concrete campus became my seminary, my mission field, and my preparation ground for a ministry I never could have imagined during my days running cocaine through South Beach. The first few years were the hardest. Adjusting to prison life when you're accustomed to luxury isn't just about missing material comforts. It's about learning to find meaning and purpose in an environment designed to strip away both. The days were long, the food was terrible, and the constant noise made privacy impossible. But slowly, I began to see opportunities where others saw only obstacles. The prison library became my classroom. I read everything I could find about theology, pastoral care, addiction recovery, and criminal justice reform. The same mind that had once calculated profit margins on cocaine shipments was now focused on understanding the psychological and spiritual factors that led people to make destructive choices. I enrolled in seminary courses through correspondence programs, eventually earning a Master Divinity degree from a respected evangelical seminary. The coursework was rigorous: systematic theology, biblical exegesis, church history, pastoral counseling, but it provided intellectual challenges that kept my mind sharp and purposeful during years that could have been wasted in bitterness and self-pity. The real education came from the inmates themselves. Coleman housed men from every conceivable background: Wall Street executives who had embezzled millions, organized crime figures from New York and Chicago, drug dealers from every major American city, and white-collar criminals whose schemes had destroyed pension funds and devastated families. What I discovered was that most of these men, regardless of their crimes or backgrounds, were dealing with the same fundamental issues: guilt, shame, anger, and a desperate search for meaning in lives that had gone catastrophically wrong. The same pastoral counseling techniques I was learning in seminary courses proved remarkably effective when applied to inmates who were struggling with addiction, family dysfunction, and spiritual emptiness. By my 5th year at Coleman, I had become the de facto chaplain for inmates who didn't feel comfortable with traditional prison religious programs. My background gave me credibility with serious criminals who might dismiss a seminary-trained minister who had never experienced street life or federal prosecution. When I talked about redemption, they listened because they knew I understood what I was talking about. The Bible study I started in my housing unit grew from 3 inmates to over 50, meeting twice a week in the recreation area. We studied scripture, but we also discussed practical issues: how to maintain relationships with family members while incarcerated, how to resist a prison culture that encouraged violence and exploitation, how to prepare for eventual release without falling back into criminal behavior. One of our most powerful studies focused on the Apostle Paul, who wrote much of the New Testament while imprisoned. The parallels weren't lost on men who were facing decades behind bars. Paul had been a persecutor of Christians before his conversion. He had used his education and social position to cause damage to innocent people, and he had found his most effective ministry while confined. "Look at this," I told the group one evening as we studied Paul's letter to the Philippians. Paul is chained to a Roman guard, probably in some dungeon worse than anything we're experiencing, and he's writing about joy and contentment. He's not focused on getting out. He's focused on making his imprisonment count for something meaningful. The transformation in many of these men was remarkable. Tony Russo, a former New York mob associate serving life for racketeering, became one of our most effective counselors for inmates struggling with gambling addiction. David Chun, a former investment advisor who had run a massive Ponzi scheme, used his financial expertise to teach money management and debt reduction to inmates preparing for release. But perhaps the most profound change was in myself. The arrogance and entitlement that had characterized my criminal career were being replaced by genuine humility and a servant's heart. Instead of planning my next scheme or calculating profit margins, I was studying how to help broken people find healing and hope. The letters from outside began to change too. My parents, who had been devastated by my criminal career and imprisonment, started expressing amazement at the person I was becoming. My father, the successful attorney who had always measured worth in terms of professional achievement, wrote to tell me that he was prouder of the man I was becoming in prison than he had ever been of the empire I had built in Miami. "Son," he wrote in one particularly moving letter, "I've spent my entire career defending people who made terrible choices, but I've rarely seen anyone take responsibility for their actions the way you have. Whatever happens with the rest of your sentence, I want you to know that you've already become the man I always hoped you would be." The most challenging aspect of my prison ministry came when I started corresponding with families who had been affected by my criminal organization. Maria Santos, the widow whose letter had initially broken my heart, became a regular correspondent and eventually a close friend. She shared her struggles with raising her children as a single mother, and I provided whatever emotional and spiritual support I could offer from behind prison walls. Through Maria, I connected with other families in Miami who had been damaged by the cocaine trade I had helped fuel. Some were victims of violence. Others were struggling with addiction. But all of them were dealing with the long-term consequences of choices made by people like me who had valued profits over people. These relationships forced me to confront the true cost of my criminal career in ways that court proceedings and sentencing hearings never could. Every letter from a mother who had lost her son to drug-related violence, every update from a family struggling to overcome addiction, every story of communities devastated by the trade I had helped organize, all of it became part of my ongoing education in the true meaning of repentance and responsibility. By my 10th year at Coleman, I had developed a reputation throughout the federal prison system as someone who could reach inmates that traditional chaplains couldn't connect with. Wardens from other institutions would request that I correspond with particular inmates who were struggling with adjustment to prison life or showing signs of radicalization. The work was emotionally exhausting, but spiritually fulfilling. Every letter I wrote, every counseling session I conducted, Every Bible study I led felt like a small payment toward a debt that could never be fully repaid. I wasn't trying to earn my way into heaven. I understood that salvation was a gift, not a reward for good behavior. But I was determined to use whatever years I had remaining to repair as much damage as possible. What I didn't know was that God was preparing me for a much larger ministry that would extend far beyond prison walls. The skills I was developing as a prison chaplain, the theological training I was receiving through correspondence courses, and most importantly, the authentic transformation that was occurring in my heart. All of it was preparation for work that would begin when I was released, but continue for the rest of my life. After 15 years of incarceration, I was no longer the cocaine kingpin who had terrorized South Florida. I was a minister who understood brokenness from the inside out, and God was about to use that understanding to reach people that traditional churches had given up on long ago. On March 22, 2013, after serving 15 years of my 25-year sentence, I walked out of USP Coleman into a world that had moved on without me. At 43 years old, I was starting over with nothing but a federal ID, $200 in gate money, and a calling that had been forged in concrete and steel. The Miami I returned to was unrecognizable. South Beach had been transformed from a cocaine playground into a legitimate international destination. The clubs where I had once laundered money through cash transactions were now corporate-owned establishments with sophisticated financial oversight. The neighborhoods where my organization had operated were gentrified beyond recognition, with condos and coffee shops replacing the drug houses and violence that had once defined the area. My re-entry was facilitated by Father Michael Rodriguez, a Catholic priest who had started a ministry for ex-federal inmates. Father Rodriguez had heard about my work at Coleman through the Prison Chaplain Network, and he offered something I never expected, a legitimate opportunity to continue the ministry that had given my life meaning behind bars. Ryan, he explained during our first meeting at his small church in Homestead, there are thousands of ex-inmates in South Florida who need exactly what you can offer, someone who understands their struggle and can show them a different path. You spent 15 years preparing for this work. Now it's time to do it. The halfway house where I was required to live for my first 6 months was located in a rough section of Miami, surrounded by the kind of poverty and desperation that breeds crime. Most of the other residents were recently released inmates struggling to find employment, maintain sobriety, and reconnect with families that had been damaged by their incarceration. I started holding informal Bible studies in the halfway house common room, using the same approaches that had been effective at Coleman. The men who attended weren't necessarily seeking religious conversion. They were looking for hope, practical guidance, and someone who understood what they were going through without judgment or condescension. Within 3 months, our weekly meetings had grown from 5 participants to over 30. We were studying scripture, but we were also addressing practical issues. How to handle job interviews with felony convictions, how to rebuild relationships with family members who had lost trust, how to resist the temptation to return to criminal behavior when legitimate opportunities seemed non-existent. The breakthrough came when I helped Marcus Johnson, a former bank robber who had served 12 years, navigate the process of reconciling with his teenage daughter who barely remembered him. Marcus had been writing to her for years, but she had never responded until I helped him craft a letter that focused on taking responsibility for his absence rather than making excuses or seeking immediate forgiveness. When Marcus's daughter finally agreed to meet him, and when I witnessed their emotional reunion at a McDonald's in North Miami, I understood that God was calling me to something much larger than informal Bible studies in a halfway house. After completing my halfway house requirement, I rented a small apartment in a working-class neighborhood and began developing what would eventually become Second Chance Ministries, a comprehensive reentry program for ex-federal inmates returning to South Florida. The ministry addressed spiritual needs, but it also tackled practical challenges that traditional churches often overlooked. We developed relationships with employers who were willing to hire people with criminal records, provided job training and interview preparation, offered financial literacy courses for people who had never learned to manage money legitimately, and most importantly, created a community where ex-inmates could find belonging without return to criminal associations. My background gave the ministry credibility with both ex-inmates and the law enforcement community. Former drug dealers trusted me because I had walked their path and survived federal prosecution. FBI agents and DEA officers supported our work because they saw it as crime prevention rather than mere rehabilitation. The most powerful aspect of our ministry was family reconciliation. I had learned at Coleman that successful reentry almost always required rebuilding relationships that had been damaged by criminal behavior. We offered family counseling, mediated difficult conversations between ex-inmates and their loved ones, and helped children understand that their parents' mistakes didn't define their own potential. 3 years after my release, Second Chance Ministries was operating out of a donated warehouse in Hialeah, serving over 200 ex-federal inmates annually and maintaining a recidivism rate below 10%, far better than the national average of nearly 70%. Our success attracted attention from federal judges, prison officials, and policymakers who were looking for evidence-based approaches to reducing repeat offenses. The personal transformation continued as well. In 2016, I married Sarah Martinez, a social worker who had grown up in Miami and understood the challenges facing formerly incarcerated individuals. Sarah had known about my past from our first conversation, but she chose to see my present and future rather than being defined by my history. Our wedding was held at the same church in Coral Gables where I had been baptized as an infant, but the ceremony was unlike anything that parish had ever witnessed. The guest list included federal judges and former drug dealers, FBI agents and ex-gang members, wealthy society figures, and people who were struggling to survive on minimum wage jobs. Father Rodriguez, who performed the ceremony, later said it was the most powerful example he had ever seen of God's ability to bring together people from different worlds through the common experience of grace and redemption. Today, 10 years after my release, Second Chance Ministries operates in 3 Florida cities and has helped over 1,000 formerly incarcerated individuals successfully reintegrate into society. We've expanded to include addiction recovery programs, victim offender mediation services, and community education initiatives that help neighborhoods understand how to support returning inmates rather than fear them. The most meaningful aspect of my work is the letters I receive from families whose lives have been touched by our ministry. Wives who have been reunited with husbands, children who have recovered relationships with parents, mothers who have seen their sons choose education over incarceration. Each story represents a victory that money could never buy. I still live modestly, in a small house in South Miami that's walking distance from our ministry headquarters. Instead of counting cocaine profits, I count souls restored. Instead of managing criminal enterprises, I manage programs that give people hope for legitimate futures. Instead of avoiding law enforcement, I work alongside agents and officers who have become genuine friends and ministry partners. The same intelligence and organizational skills that made me successful as a drug dealer now make our ministry incredibly effective at reaching people other programs can't help. The strategic thinking that once planned cocaine shipments now develops comprehensive approaches to addressing the complex factors that lead to criminal behavior. When people ask about my transformation, I tell them the truth. I didn't find God because I got caught, and I didn't change because I was afraid of prison. I found God because he met me in the darkest place of my life and offered me something I had never experienced during my years of wealth and power: genuine peace and authentic purpose. Dariah McKenzie, who built a $30 million cocaine empire, was a hollow man pursuing empty achievements. Dariah McKenzie, who leads Second Chance Ministries, is discovering what it means to build something that will last beyond his lifetime: relationships, redemption, and hope for people whose society had written off as unredeemable. Every morning, when I wake up in my small house and prepare for another day of ministry to broken people, I'm reminded that God doesn't waste anything, not even the worst chapters of our lives. He took a privileged kid who became a cocaine kingpin and turned him into someone who helps other people find the second chances that everyone deserves but few people receive. From Miami's most notorious drug dealer to one of its most unlikely ministers. That's the kind of transformation that only makes sense in God's economy, where the last can become first and the worst mistakes can become the foundation for the most powerful ministry. If this story moves you, remember that no one is beyond redemption, no mistake is too big for God's grace, and no past is too dark for his light to penetrate. Share this with someone who needs to believe that their worst chapter doesn't have to be their final chapter.